Have you ever crossed paths with someone who made you feel deeply connected, but at the same time left you completely unsure where you stood? Someone who looked at you in a way that made you feel important, yet could vanish so easily that it made you question whether it was ever real. Stick with this because by the end of it, the way you understand this kind of connection will completely shift. Not just emotionally, but mentally too. You'll start to see what's actually happening inside you and what's happening inside them. Because this isn't just confusion. It runs deeper than that. It usually begins in a very subtle way. Everything feels right in the beginning, natural, effortless. There's a strong pull that doesn't make sense logically. Conversations feel easy, emotions feel heightened, and for once, you feel genuinely seen. It creates this quiet belief that maybe this is something meaningful. But then, without a clear reason, something changes. They start to pull back. Not in an obvious or dramatic way, but slowly enough that you start questioning yourself. Replies take longer. Their energy feels different. The warmth you once felt begins to fade into distance, and suddenly you're left trying to figure out what changed. You start replaying conversations in your mind, thinking about what you said, how you said it, whether you did something wrong. You search for answers in places where none are given. And the hardest part is that nothing clearly ended. There's no closure, no explanation, just space and silence. That's where the mind gets trapped. Because when something ends clearly, your brain can process it. It can accept it and move on. But when things stay open-ended, your thoughts stay attached. You begin questioning your own worth. You wonder if they ever cared, or if you imagined the connection. You ask yourself why it feels so intense for you, but seems so effortless for them. Without realizing it, your emotional state starts depending on their behavior. When they come close, you feel valued. When they pull away, you feel rejected. This back and forth creates emotional instability that feels exhausting. And it's not because you're weak, it's actually how the brain is wired. When attention is given inconsistently, it creates a stronger emotional grip. The mind doesn't just chase the person anymore, it starts chasing the feeling they occasionally give you. That unpredictability becomes addictive. The inconsistency strengthens attachment instead of reducing it. But there's another side to this dynamic that's often misunderstood. People with avoidant patterns experience closeness differently. For them, emotional intimacy doesn't just feel comforting, it can feel overwhelming. Not because they don't feel, but because they feel deeply and struggle to manage that intensity. When connection starts to deepen, something inside them triggers a sense of pressure or fear. Fear of losing independence, fear of being emotionally exposed, fear of depending on someone. So they step back, not necessarily because you are lacking, but because the closeness itself feels too intense for them to hold comfortably. And that's where the mismatch begins. For you, love means getting closer. For them, love can sometimes mean creating distance to regain balance. So while you move toward connection, they instinctively move away from it. This creates a painful push and pull cycle where one person pursues and the other retreats. You try harder, they withdraw more. You invest more emotionally, they become more distant. And slowly, without noticing it, you begin losing your own emotional center. Your attention shifts from your own life to their reactions. You start waiting for messages, analyzing tone, overthinking silence, and attaching meaning to small moments of attention. Even when something inside you feels unsettled, you stay because the connection once felt so real. But what you're really holding on to is not the present version of them. It's the version you met at the beginning. The version that made you feel seen, chosen, and emotionally alive. And your mind keeps repeating the same idea. If it felt that real once, maybe it can return again. But the truth is, not every strong connection is meant to become stable. Some connections enter your life to reveal patterns, to show you what you tolerate in the name of love, to expose emotional wounds you didn't realize were still active. They feel intense, not because they are meant to last, but because they activate deep internal responses within you. And once you start seeing it clearly, something shifts. You stop blaming yourself for the distance. You stop chasing clarity from someone who cannot give it consistently. You stop shrinking yourself just to keep someone emotionally close. Because at the core of all of this, the real issue is not love itself, it's inconsistency. And inconsistency keeps the mind in a constant state of alertness. It never fully relaxes. It keeps waiting, hoping, scanning for the next shift in energy. That's why it feels so draining, even in silence. And once you truly understand this pattern, you don't just start seeing them differently. You start seeing yourself differently too. You start getting used to uncertainty. Over time, it doesn't even feel strange anymore. You begin to accept less than what you actually need. And somewhere along the way, you start convincing yourself that this emotional intensity must mean something real. But intensity isn't always a sign of depth or health. Sometimes it's just imbalance. Even then, the connection doesn't fully fade. It lingers in subtle ways, in thoughts that appear out of nowhere, in memories that feel like they just happened, in emotions that return without warning or permission. And that's what makes it so hard to understand, because even when your mind is ready to move forward, your feelings don't seem to cooperate. It feels incomplete, like something is still unresolved, like there's still a chapter missing, and that creates a quiet kind of hope inside you, the hope that maybe somehow things will align one day, that maybe they'll understand, that maybe it will finally make sense. But while that hope stays alive, something else is also happening inside you. You're becoming more aware. You start noticing the pattern instead of just living inside it. You begin questioning what you're actually receiving instead of just reacting to it. And this awareness is where change quietly begins. Because once you see the cycle clearly, you can't unsee it. You start realizing this isn't just about emotions. It's shaping your behavior. It's influencing your decisions. It's quietly affecting how you see yourself. And that realization shifts something inside you. You're no longer only feeling the connection. You're beginning to understand it. And that understanding brings a turning point, a moment where you stop reacting automatically, a moment where you pause before responding, a moment where a different question appears in your mind. Not, why are they like this? But why am I allowing this to continue? And that question changes the entire direction of your experience, because now the focus moves away from trying to decode them and turns toward understanding you. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable because you start noticing things you avoided before, how much effort you were really putting in, how often you were adjusting your emotions just to keep things stable, how many times you stayed quiet just to avoid distance. And slowly, a truth begins to surface. You weren't just part of the connection. You were holding it together. You were carrying something that was never balanced. That realization doesn't feel empowering in the beginning. It feels heavy because it removes the illusion that things were equal. It removes the comfort of believing that if I just try a little more, it will work. Now you see it clearly, and clarity always cuts before it heals. This is the stage where exhaustion shows up. Not from love itself, but from overextending. Not from caring, but from caring alone. And in that exhaustion, something begins to shift. You stop reacting the same way. You stop rushing to explain. You stop overgiving reassurance. You stop chasing clarity from someone who doesn't offer consistency, not out of anger, but out of awareness, because now you see the pattern. Every time you gave more, it didn't bring stability. It only deepened the imbalance. And for the first time, you start pulling your energy back. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly. There's still attachment, yes. There's still hope in the background. But there's also a new part of you forming, one that starts choosing differently. You begin choosing peace over intensity, clarity over confusion, yourself over uncertainty. And that's where everything starts to feel unfamiliar, because now you're not acting from habit anymore. You're acting from self-respect. You're no longer trying to secure their presence. You're protecting your own. That internal shift naturally creates space, not forced distance, but real emotional separation. And when that happens, the dynamic begins to change, because the energy they were used to receiving is no longer available in the same way. The access they once had starts to close. The reactions they expected don't come as easily anymore, and that creates discomfort on their side. Not always openly, not always immediately, but it registers, because when someone realizes they no longer have the same effortless access to you, something shifts in their awareness. They start noticing your absence differently. They feel the change in the dynamic. You are no longer chasing, no longer waiting, no longer proving anything. And that version of you, the one that was always available, is no longer the version they're interacting with. That creates reflection. even if they resist it. But this is also where many people lose themselves again, because the moment they feel even a small sign of return, they rush back into old patterns. They reopen access too quickly. They re-enter the same emotional position, and the cycle quietly resets. But if you stay grounded in awareness, something deeper develops. Stability. You start becoming emotionally steady in a way you weren't before. You no longer depend on their behavior to feel okay. Your peace stops being conditional, and that changes your perception completely. You're no longer impressed by temporary attention, no longer moved by inconsistency, no longer willing to lose yourself for something uncertain. This is growth, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And once it settles in, there's no going back to the old version of you. Even if they return, even if they show effort, even if they try to reconnect, you don't meet them from the same emotional place anymore. There's no urgency, no confusion, no blindness to red flags. There is clarity, and that clarity gives you something powerful. Not control over them, but control over yourself. From here, the connection is no longer the center of your world. It becomes a reflection of what you're willing to accept. And in that space, reality starts to speak for itself. Because when you are no longer operating from need, only two things can happen in response. Either consistency shows up or distance becomes permanent. There is no longer a middle ground where confusion can survive because you are no longer feeding it with your attention. And that's where the truth finally becomes visible, not through words, but through behavior and outcomes. They can no longer rely on your emotional availability without offering something stable in return. And that's where a different kind of pressure begins to form. Not something you create, but something they feel internally. Because now they're faced with a choice they've been avoiding. Step forward with clarity or lose access to you altogether. And this is where real change can finally become possible. Not because you pushed harder, not because you waited longer, but because you stopped participating in something that didn't align with you anymore. If they are capable of growth, something starts to happen within them too. They begin to look inward. They start noticing patterns they ignored before. They begin to see what they pushed away too easily. And for the first time, your absence doesn't feel neutral. It feels real. That absence creates reflection, and slowly their behavior may start to shift. More consistency, more presence, more intention. Not perfect, not instant, but noticeable. Because now they understand something they didn't respect before. You are no longer guaranteed. And that realization can wake something up in them. But here's what matters most. Even if they come back differently, you are no longer the same person who used to wait. You don't fall into old patterns again. You don't ignore what you've learned. You don't confuse progress with words alone. You don't accept half effort dressed up as change. You stand on what you now know you deserve, and that's where a different kind of connection becomes possible. Not one built on confusion or emotional instability, but one built on clarity. Not driven by highs and lows, but grounded in consistency and mutual effort. And if both people truly meet at that level, then something real can begin. But not the fantasy version from the past. Something stronger, something healthier, something conscious, something chosen through growth instead of fear. But if that shift doesn't happen, if they stay the same, if they remain distant, if their patterns don't evolve, then the other outcome naturally unfolds. And this one is just as meaningful. You let go. Not from pain, not from frustration, but from clarity. Because now you see things without distortion. You understand that connection alone isn't enough. You understand that feelings without action don't build anything stable. You understand that holding on to potential only delays your own life. And that understanding frees you completely. There is no more waiting for change, no more analyzing mixed signals, no more emotional dependence on what they might do next. You move forward lighter, clearer, more aligned with yourself than ever before. And the most powerful truth in all of this is simple. In both outcomes, you win. If they grow, you meet them as an equal, from strength, not need. If they don't, you walk away with your self-worth intact without losing yourself in the process. There is no real loss anymore, only evolution. Because what felt like emotional confusion was actually a process guiding you back to yourself. It was never just about them. It was about you learning to stop accepting inconsistency as love, learning to stop chasing validation, learning to recognize your worth without needing it constantly confirmed by someone else. And once that shift happens, everything changes. Not just this connection, but every connection that follows. Because now you don't chase intensity. You look for alignment. You don't get lost in emotional highs. You value consistency. And you don't abandon yourself just to keep someone close. You choose yourself, regardless of who stays or leaves. And that's what real emotional maturity looks like. Not holding on no matter what, but knowing when staying costs more than walking away. So, if something is truly meant for you, it won't survive your confusion. It will meet you in your clarity. Not in the version of you that is anxious, attached, or uncertain, but in the version of you that no longer needs to chase anything to feel whole. So if something is truly meant for you, it won't survive your confusion. It will meet you in your clarity. Not in the version of you that is anxious, attached, or uncertain, but in the version of you that no longer needs to chase anything to feel whole. And this is where everything finally settles into perspective, because when you look back at what you went through, you realize something important. You were never just reacting to a person. You were reacting to a pattern, a dynamic that pulled you in, activated your emotions, and kept your attention locked through uncertainty. At the time, it felt like love. It felt like destiny. It felt like something rare. But now you can see it more clearly. It wasn't just connection that kept you there. It was inconsistency. It was unpredictability. It was the emotional gap between closeness and distance that made everything feel amplified. And when you remove the confusion, what remains is clarity. You start to understand that real connection doesn't keep you in a constant state of questioning. Real connection doesn't make you overthink your value. Real connection doesn't require you to shrink yourself, adjust yourself, or constantly interpret silence. Real connection feels steady. Even when it's challenging, it still feels grounded. And that's the difference you begin to recognize. But the deeper shift happens inside you, not in them. Because once you go through this experience fully, something changes in your emotional system. You stop attaching meaning to inconsistency. You stop romanticizing confusion. You stop interpreting emotional distance as something you need to fix. Instead, you begin to observe. You notice patterns faster. You recognize behavior earlier. You don't ignore the small signals anymore because you already know where they lead. And slowly, your standards stop being something you say. They become something you live. You no longer debate whether you're asking for too much. You no longer question whether consistency is reasonable. You no longer try to justify emotional unavailability just because there are moments of affection mixed in. Because now, you understand something fundamental. Consistency is not a bonus. It is the foundation. Without it, nothing stable can exist. And that realization alone changes how you move through every connection after this. You stop rushing in. You stop over-investing early. You stop giving full access to people who haven't shown full presence. Not because you are cold, but because you are aware. And awareness changes everything. It changes how you speak. It changes how you choose. It changes how you respond when someone pulls away. Because now, instead of chasing, you observe. Instead of over-explaining, you step back. Instead of filling silence with anxiety, you let silence reveal truth. And in that space, something powerful begins to develop. Self-trust. For a long time, you may have trusted your feelings more than your judgment. You felt strongly, so you assumed it must mean something real. You stayed because your emotions felt intense, even when the situation didn't feel stable. But now, your trust starts shifting inward. You begin to trust your observations more than your impulses. You trust patterns more than potential. You trust consistency more than words. And that is where emotional maturity quietly forms. Not in becoming distant, but in becoming discerning. Not in shutting down feelings, but in no longer letting feelings override truth. And once that balance is formed, you stop losing yourself in connections that were never balanced to begin with. You stop trying to earn stability from people who cannot offer it. You stop interpreting emotional highs as signs of long-term potential. And most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself just to keep someone else close. because now you understand something that changes everything. If you have to lose yourself to maintain a connection, you are already losing it. And that realization brings peace, even if it comes with discomfort at first. Because growth doesn't always feel soft in the beginning. Sometimes it feels like withdrawal. Sometimes it feels like silence. Sometimes it feels like walking away from something that still pulls at your emotions. But underneath that discomfort, something stronger is forming. A version of you that is no longer easily destabilized. A version of you that doesn't confuse attention with consistency. A version of you that doesn't collapse when someone pulls away. And that version changes your entire emotional reality. You no longer live in reaction. You no longer wait for reassurance to feel grounded. You no longer measure your worth through someone else's behavior. You become anchored in yourself. And from that place, everything you once found confusing starts to look simple. Not because the situation changed, but because you did. And this is the point most people don't fully recognize while they are inside these cycles. They think the goal is to get clarity from the other person. But the real shift happens when you become clear within yourself. Because once you are clear, confusion loses its power. Mixed signals stop feeling meaningful. Distance stops feeling personal. And emotional inconsistency stops feeling like something you need to solve. Instead, it becomes information. Just data, not a story you attach yourself to. And when that happens, your entire emotional world reorganizes itself. You no longer chase closure from people who cannot provide it. You no longer wait for explanations that never come. You no longer depend on someone else to make sense of what you already understand internally. You become your own closure. And that is freedom. Not loud freedom, not dramatic freedom, but quiet, steady freedom that changes how you breathe in your own life. And from here, even if old connections reappear, they no longer hold the same power over you, because you are no longer meeting them from the same emotional place. You are not the same version of yourself who once waited, hoped, analyzed, and overgave. You are the version that sees clearly, and clarity does something powerful. It removes attachment from confusion. So now, even if someone returns with words, gestures, or temporary consistency, you don't get pulled back into the illusion. You don't forget what you learned. You don't ignore the pattern. You don't trade your peace for potential. Instead, you observe and you choose. And that choice becomes your strength, because at this stage, your life is no longer shaped by who stays or leaves. It is shaped by what you allow to continue. And anything that cannot meet your clarity naturally falls away, not because you pushed it out, but because you stopped fitting into it. And that is the final transformation. Not winning someone back, not proving your worth, not fixing a dynamic that was never balanced, but becoming someone who no longer participates in what breaks them slowly. Someone who no longer confuses inconsistency with connection. Someone who understands that love at its core should not feel like confusion you have to decode every day. It should feel like something you can stand on, something that adds to your life, not consumes your peace. And once you reach that understanding, you don't just move on from a person, you move on from a pattern. And that is what truly changes everything.